This video is a short introduction to English 312, Contemporary Canadian Literature. My name's Roger Davis and I'll be teaching this section of the course. The central question that we're going to be asking in this class is what defines Canadian literature, if anything? So that immediately raises two things. What is the Canadian literature that we read? What is the Canadian literature that we're aware of? And how do we define Canada? What goes into constructing our imagination of the nation? So if you were to stop someone on the street in Red Deer, where some of us might live, and say, what Canadian authors can you name? What answers do you think you would get? Would they be able to name anyone? 1, 2, 5? How many Canadian authors are you yourself familiar with? How many Canadian books have you read? Similarly, if you were traveling in a foreign country and someone stopped you and said, you don't look like you're from around here, where are you from? I'm from Canada. Oh, really? Canada? What's that like? What's it like living in Canada? What would you say? So these kinds of things that come to our mind, we have to ask ourselves, whose Canada is this? How does this go into or contribute to constructing some sense of nationhood? And we'll find very quickly that the answer to this can be quite complicated. It can be very simplistic if we want it to be, but it's usually overly simplistic. So I'm just going to run through a few ways that we can think about Canadian identity as a way to get you to approach the text that we're reading for this course with a bunch of directions in mind. Okay, so the first one that we can identify is that Canada frequently defines itself by what it's not. Okay? That we can say, well, Canada is not American. We're not like Americans. We're different somehow. Americans have lots of guns and expensive health care. And Canada, we don't have a lot of guns and our health care is free. And that's a really kind of, overly simplistic, popularized notion of what constitutes Canadian identity. It's true, I think, but it really doesn't go far enough. So if we want to take that farther, how much farther can we take this? How complicated can we make, or how complex can we make this definition of Canada? So for example, we could say, well, Canada is not like Britain. We have certainly ties to Britain. The Queen's still on our money, for example. Then we have the whole French question to deal with, and we're not French either, but we're French and English. And so we see, we're not British and we're not French and we're not American. And what we quickly find here is that we are defining ourselves by what we're not, through a kind of nationalistic sense. Okay, we're not the nation of America, we're not the nation of Britain, we're not the nation of France. Well, that's fine. It's like saying I'm not green. Well, then what color are you? Okay, so that we can flip that around and say, well, what are the positive things that we can say about Canada? That Canada is this and Canada is that. So for example, when I travel to other places, I sometimes like to perpetuate the reality and the myth of Canada as a cold place. It's very cold where I live. It can be -40. Then we have a discussion of what it's like to live there. But looking out my window right now, it's +15 in September and quite lovely out. So it's not always cold and frigid. And so we perpetuate, at least I do, these myths about Canada as this cold Nordic country, and to some extent it's accurate, but at the same time it's also got a lot of stereotypes associated with it. So what kinds of affirmative things can we say about Canada as a nation? That should also raise the question of what constitutes a nation. Okay? Because we're not America, we're not Britain, we're not France. What is Canada in a positive way? Okay? How do we define ourselves with our government, with our geography, and so forth? So that brings us to the second thing, which is the geography of Canada. Canada is a really big place, second biggest country in the world. Notice second biggest country. Nationalism is still there, right? So in terms of the geography of Canada, we've got the Atlantic provinces, we've got Quebec, which is culturally distinct from Ontario, then we have the prairies, which is its own thing, and then we have BC, which is its own thing, then we have the North, which is its own thing. What we find is that Canada has a very regional history in terms of its literary traditions. You have the Montreal scene, you have a lot of writers in Ontario. But what you find in Canadian literature is that some of the writers, say, coming out of Vancouver on the West Coast in the 1960s, might have more in common with writers coming out of the western coast of the United States through Washington and Oregon and California, because they share a similar geography. And the writers there share a coastline and weather patterns and things. And you might find that the writers in Vancouver are more like the writers in Portland, Oregon, or in San Francisco than they are in Ontario. And so then we find that despite the fact that we might want to define Canada as opposite to America or not as America, we find that there's more connections sometimes between the north-south than the east-west, simply because of this massive geographical distance. And the Atlantic provinces are different from the West Coast provinces, and the writers in the north are different from the prairie writers, and so on. So geography is a big question in Canadian literature. We then, of course, have the linguistic traditions within Canadian literature, that we have English literature and we have French literature. Those are the two dominant traditions, I think. And, for example, when I went to university, you couldn't teach French literature in English courses. That it was English Canadian literature in one department and French Canadian literature in another department, and the two departments didn't really talk to each other. And there's some reason for this historically. But even go farther back than that, if you wanted to take a course in Canadian literature, if you wanted to take this course in the 1950s, most universities in Canada didn't even have a course on Canadian literature. We didn't really think Canada had a literature, really, until kind of the late 1950s, and I'll talk more about that later in the course. So there's this linguistic question that's caught up with nationalism. Often languages are nationalistic, but not always. What's the French and the English traditions of literature? But that raises all sorts of other questions about First Nations and Indigenous literatures. It raises all sorts of questions about other geographies, like the immigrant populations in Canada. That what is it like to be a Filipino immigrant or a Chinese immigrant, or second generation or third generation Chinese or Filipino immigrant, or what have you, writing in Canada? What is that experience like? It's, I'm guessing, nothing like the experience of being a French or an English descendant in Canada. And so we have geography, which is tied to this linguistic tradition. So it might be a local geography of Canada, it might be a foreign geography of an immigrant tradition. Which raises another question about Canada, which is, say, the historical idea of Canada as an immigrant nation, Canada as a colonial nation, and then Canada later as a multicultural nation. You may or may not know this, but the Canadian Multicultural Act wasn't really written into law until 1982. It was ratified as late as 86. So it's a relatively recent phenomenon, only 40 years ago. But now everybody kind of thinks that Canada is a multicultural thing, despite the fact that it's a relatively recent phenomenon. So what does it mean to be in a largely immigrant, largely colonial, now largely multicultural society, on top of First Nations and Indigenous history that may or may not get taught, or gets taught to different extents in the school system? So as we grow up learning in the school system in Canada, what kinds of histories, what kinds of languages are we taught, what kinds of geographies do we experience, and it might be different for different people. And all these things contribute to what it means to think about Canada, to live in Canada, and to call yourself a Canadian. Just anecdotally, I was playing soccer with someone who was clearly linguistically marked as an immigrant. And I asked him, where are you from originally? And he said, Quebec. And I paused, and I knew he was lying, and he was kidding with me. He said, no, I'm just joking. I'm from Afghanistan. But he knew, that would trouble me. And it was funny because I'm sure he gets asked that question all the time, right? Being a new immigrant to Canada. And so what is that experience of Canada like for a first-generation immigrant coming to this nation, right? He's now a Canadian citizen. What is his version of Canada that's consistent with my version of Canada, or that's very radically different from my version of Canada? So these are the kinds of questions that we'll be asking in the course. So one of the challenges of a second-year course like this is to try and give you as students a representative example of Canadian literature. And that's very difficult to do in a half-year course like this in one term. I've put 4 books on the course trying to give you a representative sampling of some of the things that we could talk about with Canadian literature, but it's by no means exhaustive. So as we progress through the books, use these books as prompts to think about broader questions of Canadian national identity. What does it mean to be Canadian for the writers that we're reading and for you as readers? Okay, that what is Canada and how do different people experience it in different ways? One other thing I'll mention that's in the course outline is that it says that this is a course that will introduce you to modern and postmodern ideas about Canadian literature, and we'll certainly touch on these terms just really quickly to give you a sense of what that is. The modern period is generally seen as kind of the first half of the 20th century. The postmodern period is arguably the second half of the 20th century and beyond. I mention this because we're not going to really spend a lot of time with modern literature, that most of the books that I've put on the course are very contemporary. The earliest book is Atwood's Oryx and Crake, which is 2003. The next most recent book is Thomas King, I believe it's 2014. And then Larissa Lai's Tiger Flu is 2018. And then Josh Whitehead's Johnny Appleseed is 2019 and 2020 and 2019. So all the books on this course are really, really recent. And I did that for a reason. One reason is that I want you to read very contemporary literature to get us out of this trap of thinking that, oh, well, back in the 1960s, they thought this way. Because a lot of people still think that way from the 1960s, that we'll talk about this more, but some of the thinking hasn't changed. But also, some of the books that we're going to be reading take these questions about Canadian national identity in very non-traditional ways. And I want us to think about that in this very recent history, that something like Margaret Atwood's Oryx and Crake and Larissa Lai's Tiger Flu don't really address Canadian national identity as Canadian national identity. They're both Canadian writers, but there's very little discussion of things that we might identifiably say, yeah, that's a Canadian thing right there. And so it's almost like the books aren't Canadian. And that's something I want us to think about as we read, is that we all come with baggage to this course about Canadian identity, and then we encounter these writers that don't really reinforce, or it forces us to question those assumptions we have about Canadian national identity.